session of the Senate and the second regular session of the 18th Congress is hereby called to order. Senator Francis Tolentino will lead the chamber in prayer.
Almighty Father, Creator of heaven and earth, we call upon you in the midst of these trying and uncertain times. Lord, we continue to lift up to you our frontliners who, from day one, have selflessly served our nation. We also pray for the healing of our people who are afflicted with COVID-19, whether they be in critical condition in the hospitals or isolating themselves at home. In your name, we claim their complete healing and restoration of their strength. In this time of economic crisis, help our people who have lost their jobs, with the businesses who have closed down, to rebound and recover what they have lost. Not only do we pray for healing over our land, but as you have calmed the stormy waters of the Sea of Galilee, we lift up to you the troubled waters of the West Philippine Sea. Give our leaders wisdom as they uphold our sovereignty, and always guide them towards the path of peace. As our country eagerly awaits the arrival of COVID-19 vaccines, we claim your blessings of peace and unity. We further declare it as your victory, that the people of the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao have started to fully achieve genuine and meaningful autonomy in line with their ideals and aspirations, as they have recently celebrated their second founding anniversary. As the first month of the year 2021 came to a close, we look back and thank you for allowing us to pass over this new decade. Continue to bless all the members of this chamber, as well as the staff and employees of this institution, not only with your might and power, but with your hope and peace as well in the daunting days ahead. Amen.
Well, Secretary will please call the roll.
Roll call of members, the Honorable Senators Angara,
Present.
Binay,
Present.
Cayetano, De Lima, De La Rosa,
Present.
Drilon,
Present.
Chalian, Go,
Present. Present.
Gordon,
Present.
Ontiveros,
Present.
Lacson, Lapid, Marcos,
Present.
Pacquiao,
Present.
Pangilinan,
Present.
Pimentel III, Poe,
Present.
Recto,
Present.
Revilla Jr.,
Present.
Tolentino, Villanueva, Villar,
Present.
Zubiri. Senate President Soto III is present.
With 8 senators physically present and 15 senators virtually present for a total of 23, the chair declares the presence of a quorum. Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I move that we dispense with the reading of the Journal of the 41st Session, Monday, February 1, 2021. I so move.
Any objection? Oh, by the way, before we approve it, just for the record, if there are no objections, with the permission of the chairman of the Committee on Local Government, the presiding officer wants to be a co-sponsor of the Republic Act 6222. So for the record, into the journal.
Yes.
All right. So recorded.
Yes, Mr. President.
Thank you. Any objection to the approval of the journal? Hearing none. Journal is approved.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I move that we proceed with the reference of business.
Secretary will proceed with reference of business.
Reference of business, bills on first reading, Senate number 2028, an act reapportioning the first legislative district of the city of Caloocan into 2 legislative districts, introduced by Senator Marcos.
To the Committee on Local Government and Electoral Reforms.
Senate Number 2029, an act exempting medications and vaccines from certain provisions of Republic Act Number 11223, otherwise known as the Universal Healthcare Act during public health emergencies, introduced by Senator Soto III and Cayetano.
To the Committee on Health.
Addition.
As additional reference of business.
Additional reference of business, bills on first reading, Senate Number 2030, an act converting and expanding the Leyte Industrial Development Estate into the Leyte Ecological Industrial Zone, creating for this purpose the Leyte Ecological Industrial Zone Authority and appropriating funds therefore, introduced by Senator Villa Jr.
To the Committees on Economic Affairs, Environment, Ways and Means, and Finance.
Senate Number 2031, an act creating the Eastern Visayas Development Authority, defining its powers and functions and providing funds therefore, introduced by Senator Villa Jr.
To the Committees on Government Corporations, Economic Affairs, and Finance.
Senate Number 2032, an act establishing in the city of Calbayog, province of Samar, a tertiary hospital to be known as the Samar Island Medical Center and appropriating funds therefore, introduced by Senator Villa Jr.
To the Committees on Health and Finance.
Senate Number 2033, an act renaming the Eastern Visayas Regional Medical Center in the city of Tacloban, province of Leyte, into Eastern Visayas Medical Center, increasing its bed capacity from 500 to 1,500 beds and appropriating funds therefore, introduced by Senator Revilla Jr.
To the Committees on Health and Finance.
Senate Number 2034, an act converting the Schistosomiasis Control and Research Center in Palo, Leyte into a general hospital to be known as the Governor Benjamin T. Romualdez General Hospital and Schistosomiasis Center, increasing its bed capacity from 25 to 100, upgrading its professional healthcare services and facilities, authorizing the increase of its medical personnel and appropriating funds therefore, introduced by Senator Revilla Jr.
To the Committees on Health and Finance.
Senate Number 2035, an act to uphold the academic freedom in the University of the Philippines, amending for the purpose Republic Act Number 9500, otherwise known as the University of the Philippines Charter of 2008, and for other purposes, introduced by Senator De Lima.
To the Committee on Higher Education.
Resolutions, PS Resolution Number 627, resolution directing the appropriate Senate committee to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation into the alarming reports of human trafficking, abuse, rape, and imprisonment involving overseas Filipino workers in the Middle East, including the allegations of mistreatment of the said victims by the Philippine Embassy in Damascus, Syria, and its failure to immediately effect their repatriation, thereby causing further distress and hardship to the overseas Filipino workers, introduced by Senator Marcos.
To the Committees on Labor and Foreign Relations.
PS Resolution Number 628, resolution urging the appropriate Senate committee to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation on the recent instances of red tagging by the Armed Forces of the Philippines of alumni of the University of the Philippines following the unilateral abrogation of the 1989 UP-DND Accord, introduced by Senator De Lima.
To the Committees on National Defense and Higher Education.
PS Resolution Number 629, resolution directing the appropriate Senate committee to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation on the reported depletion of the passport revolving fund of the Department of Foreign Affairs with the end in view of promoting good governance by improving government transparency and accountability, introduced by Senator De Lima.
To the Blue Ribbon Committee.
PS Resolution Number 631, resolution urging the Senate Committee on Women, Children, Family Relations, and Gender Equality to conduct an investigation in aid of legislation on the issue of trafficked Filipino women in Syria and the gendered dimensions of human trafficking, introduced by Senator Ontiveros.
To the Committees on Women and Labor. Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, our dear colleague, my kababayan from Mindanao and Silingan, my neighbor in Cagayan de Oro, would like to avail of the privileged hour. May we recognize the distinguished gentleman from Cagayan de Oro in the Republic of the Philippines, no other than Senator Aquilino Coco Pimentel III.
The former Senate President, Senator Aquilino Coco Pimentel III, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, my distinguished colleagues, magandang hapon po sa inyo lahat. Today, I rise and take the floor on a matter of personal and collective privilege concerning the urgency of improving broadband connectivity in our country and how the Philippines may be one of the first countries in Southeast Asia to be covered by the Starlink connectivity. On December 28, 2020, this representation together with my legislative staff attended an online meeting with the representative of SpaceX, a private space flight company owned by Mr. Elon Musk, who is now reportedly the world's richest person. The meeting was arranged by my good friend, Mr. Ramon Garcia, because we heard about this Starlink project and we wanted to know more about it. The video conference was part of the SpaceX initiative to discuss and educate on the Starlink satellite broadband project and its potential near global coverage of the populated world by 2021. As good news is for sharing, it is worthy to note that SpaceX assured me and my team that Starlink will be covering the Philippines in their estimate by the third quarter of 2021. So, what is this Starlink project, Mr. President? It is a global satellite broadband constellation being developed by SpaceX. It is in fact expected to be the biggest satellite constellation in human history. At the same time, it endeavors to provide high-speed, low-latency broadband connectivity across the globe, including to locations where the internet has been too expensive, too unreliable, or entirely unavailable. As a brief background, SpaceX started to develop its product, Starlink Global Broadband, in 2015. Two prototype test satellites were launched in February 2018. Thereafter, additional test satellites and operational satellites were deployed in May 2019. To date, Starlink is serving its first customers in the United States and Canada, and they are currently acting very fast to offer services internationally. We were also informed that Starlink has received permission from the U.S. Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, to put as many as 12,000 satellites above Earth. However, based on its own website, the Starlink constellation will consist of around 4,400 satellites. So these satellites will form the said Starlink constellation, and this constellation of satellites is in low Earth orbit, LEO, and designed to work in combination with ground transceivers for fast internet signals. So how will this project possibly benefit the Philippines' communications and broadband landscape? As Starlink CEO Elon Musk would have it, Starlink will serve the hardest to serve customers that telecommunications companies otherwise have trouble doing with landlines or even with cell radio stations. This is good news because the project will potentially ensure that unserved and underserved rural areas in the Philippines will be given access points to the internet. I have seen a survey which shows that there is really a digital divide in our country. Around 70% can access the internet, 30% do not access the internet because maybe they cannot access the internet. Since Starlink promises a wider coverage, rural areas and poor communities may have better access to remote learning, digital education, healthcare, and other social services, banking services, as well as information on disaster and emergency preparedness. But how about the cost of Starlink Internet? According to the company, it offers high-speed internet connection through its competitive broadband package. Right now, what is available is what they have called the better than nothing beta test. The initial Starlink service is priced at $99 a month, in addition to $499 upfront cost to order the Starlink kit. That kit includes a user terminal to connect to the satellites, what you call a satellite dish, a tripod, and a Wi-Fi router. But of course, it is expected that the price, the specifications, and the capabilities will improve over time. The price will improve as economies of scale is being achieved by the company. Although this initiatory engagement with SpaceX is both timely and encouraging, we fully know there are various legal barriers under our laws which we should take into account. And this is actually the purpose of this speech, to bring this up so that we can work on this together if we want to take advantage of the technological advancement like coverage over the Philippines of satellite broadband internet service. So during our online meeting, legal requirements in terms of protection and the ability of the Philippine government to engage with SpaceX were also discussed. Starlink, being one that provides internet access to the public, may be considered a public utility and thus subject to the constitutional restrictions under the law. Under our 1987 Constitution, the operation of a public utility is restricted and reserved to Filipino citizens. Article 12, Section 11, no franchise, certificate, or any other form of authorization for the operation of a public utility shall be granted except to citizens of the Philippines or to corporations or associations organized under the laws of the Philippines, at least 60% of whose capital is owned by such citizens. Moreover, under Republic Act number 7925 or the Philippine Telecommunications Policy Act of the Philippines, satellite broadband service providers and network operators such as Starlink using an international satellite system are classified as public telecom entities. As such, Starlink must secure a legislative franchise from Congress authorizing it to engage in a certain type of telecommunication service. It is also required to obtain a certificate of public convenience and necessity from the National Telecommunications Commission before it can operate in the country. Well, at any rate, this is the product of our research. We may be wrong. In relation to satellite user terminals and ground stations like the Starlink gateways, our Radio Control Act or RA 3846 limits licenses of wireless equipment and services to 40% foreign ownership. So there are regulations which we have encountered at first glance, and these regulations left as these are would be a hurdle for prospective satellite broadband market entrants that would want to provide internet service to the country. Mr. President, universal, faster, and affordable internet services are vital to support our country's economic recovery post-COVID-19 and help us build our
sir, yan po
better
ay
normal.
internet project ba ni Elon Musk, yung SpaceX mo?
I will, is that part of interpellation, Mr. President? Okay. Anyway, we will respond later. The ongoing pandemic and the recent natural calamities highlight the reality that connectivity is life. Our country will immensely benefit from pervasive connectivity, which can make possible effective contact tracing, quarantine monitoring, improve and accessible government services, enhance security, business continuity, expansion of e-commerce, online education and learning, digital public service, as well as enable our people to get back to work to save our economy and stave off hunger and job destruction. Given this latest advancement in technology presented to us by SpaceX, I encourage our Department of Information and Communications Technology, the DICT, to take a look at how the government can take advantage of this project hand in hand or under our national broadband program. I also call on the administrators of our NBP to consider this development and explore whether the NBP's objective of providing universal, faster, and affordable internet access for all Filipinos can be achieved through this satellite broadband option. Now that the public has heard the good news, we ask now the following question. Is the government willing to work on the legal barriers to accessing the latest advantages in connectivity? Should we take advantage of this technology, or should we just let go of this opportunity because of the obstacles? There are 110 million Filipinos in our country, and many millions of our citizens are in other countries, their host countries, or on the world seas, whose lives could be greatly improved by access to the internet. And in this new normal we live in now, the Filipino people deserve nothing less but the full benefits of digitization as a constitutional right. Thank you, Mr. President, and my dear colleagues, for your time and attention.
Mr. President.
Senator Villanueva is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. With the distinguished gentleman from Cagayan de Oro, our good friend, Senator Pimentel, yield to some clarificatory questions, Mr. President, from this representation.
Willingly, sir, and I will just try my best to answer. But I will admit if I do not know the answer.
Thank you, Mr. President. I am not a techie person, and I would just put on record some of this representation's experience, and with regard to the privileged speech of the distinguished gentleman from Cagayan de Oro City. At the onset, let me put on record my appreciation and support to the gentleman from Cagayan de Oro. Indeed, connectivity is life, and to call for universal and faster internet connection, Mr. President, ay karapat-dapat lamang, especially nowadays that we are in this pandemic situation where we call almost everything, Mr. President, nagbago. May new normal in the way we conduct business, in the way we work, in the way we study, Mr. President. My first question, Mr. President, is if the distinguished gentleman from Cagayan de Oro aware of perhaps the average internet speed in the Philippines and how this particular speed here in the country are or compare to the global average internet speed?
Mr. President, I do not know the averages, but of course I know the sentiment of the consumers that it must be slow because we have heard a lot of complaints. And before me are the different plans of PLDT, Globe, Converge, ICT Sky with the cost, with the price, and then the speed. So we can probably compare the speed at what price, given also the price of the projected price of Starlink connectivity.
Yes, Mr. President. I have here with me, and I'm not sure if the distinguished gentleman from Cagayan de Oro would agree with this information. A World Bank study shows that the average mobile broadband download speed in the Philippines is only 16.76 megabytes per second. I don't know if this is for real, Mr. President. I encountered this particular study from World Bank. It's only 16.76 megabytes per second here in the Philippines, which is well below, Mr. President, the global average of 32.01 Mbps, Mr. President. So halos kalahati po, Mr. President.
Yeah.
Would the gentleman from Cagayan de Oro agree with this data?
What I have is 18.49 Mbps as of November 2020. So still way below
from the global average.
the global of
Yes.
32.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for that, Mr. President. And similarly, would the gentleman be aware of as to the average cost naman of internet connection in the Philippines? And again, how does it compare to other countries with the cost in other countries?
I do not have the figure with me, Mr. President.
The data that this representation gathered, Mr. President, according to International Telecommunication Union, mobile cellular services and fixed broadband services are priced at $22.24 for mobile cellular services. And for fixed broadband services, it's $59 per month, respectively, among the highest in the world, Mr. President. My only point, Mr. President, that I'd like to share with the body and the distinguished gentleman from Cagayan de Oro is that as the pandemic pushed us to adopt alternative work arrangements or attend school at home, a slow and expensive internet connection is clearly a threat to inclusion, productivity, motivation, and morale of Filipino workers and learners. Would the gentleman from Cagayan de Oro agree?
Yes, I think, Mr. President, the good gentleman from Bulacan has captured real life scenarios. You know that difficult. I think we have seen footages of not only students but even their teachers. Climbing on top of roofs or maybe going to a hill just to get a mountain top or just to get a signal. So that's sad commentary of the actual state of affairs. But may I since I have seen my my information here about the price, Mr. President, I have here for the information of gentleman to compare to his source. I have here $56.24 is the cost in the Philippines, but it's a per a plan per 100 Mbps.
Oh.
Is that also is the $51.59 dollars cited by the gentleman for also for
That's for fixed
100
broadband services.
for
Yeah.
but
Perhaps
the speed 100 Mbps.
I would think that it
So we
is
can compare.
only a program, Mr. President.
But the problem, Mr. President, is that as the gentleman, the good gentleman from Bulacan has mentioned to me, what is the real life speed that we achieve when we use our internet service may not be the same or may fall far short of the advertised
Exactly.
speed. So
That's where I'm going, Mr. President, distinguished colleague from Cagayan de Oro, and obviously I'm here today. I'm standing before you to air some of our kababayan's complaints about this particular issue. And the Senate, Mr. President, is not spared on this particular issue. We have seen a lot of our colleagues talking and sharing vital information while we are conducting hearings, Mr. President, and all of a sudden, mawawala or mag-freeze na lang sila,
Freeze
Mr.
na lang.
President. No? We have seen this like every single day, Mr. President. Just this morning, I had a hearing with the Committee on Higher and Technical Education. We couldn't hear Chairman Popoy de Vera for quite some time, Mr. President. So I'm going to that particular issue, Mr. President, about misleading ads on internet speed. At present, Mr. President, as the distinguished gentleman from Cagayan de Oro made mention, for example, if I am a consumer of a particular internet service provider and I'm paying for 300 Mbps, as advertised, Mr. President, it doesn't necessarily mean that I am getting 300 Mbps all the time. In fact, I have never experienced, I don't think I was able to experience, Mr. President, all my life, a 300 Mbps connection. And that's the reason why I'm here physically present, Mr. President, because I'm having a hard time doing online sessions in my place. So, Mr. President, my question is at present, what are the basic information, particularly on internet speed, internet service providers have to declare in their public advertisements? Can the good gentleman share with us the standards perhaps required by law in internet package advertising?
The technical requirements, I'm not ready to answer this afternoon, Mr. President. But of course, there is a basic principle in advertising, the Truth in Advertising Act.
Yes.
So I think consumer groups should be activated. They should band together, get together, and get some techie people who know how to measure, di ba? You know how to measure internet speed, because I think I think there are two aspects of the internet which are measured, di ba? The download speed and then the upload speed, and I think these are not always the same. No? So, una sa lahat, when they advertise a certain number Mbps, what is that? Is that the speed of the download, or is that the speed also of the upload? Diba? Ang upload yata is when the user wants to send a file over the internet, no? So that's it. So I think it's about time that since more and more of our people, especially younger ones and even the older ones, are now forced to use the internet. So we have to be this discriminating or knowledgeable about the technicalities behind the internet. So ano ba yung mga speed na yan? Kasi sometimes baka may palusot sila eh. May sasabihin sila na X Mbps yan because ganyan-ganyan. So we should be able to understand the reasoning, and if it's not a valid reasoning, it's really just ano tawag mo dun, just confusing the consumer, then we should be able to, the consumers should through their sheer might, with the help also of policymakers with oversight function, we can we can call for truth in advertising by our internet service providers.
Well, thank you, Mr. President, and the distinguished gentleman from Cagayan de Oro accurately described the poor situation of our subscribers being victimized by wrong advertisement. In my observation, Mr. President, internet providers oftentimes advertise the maximum speed. And this is where the feeling of deception and disappointment on the part of consumers happen. However, according to NTC, maximum speed is dependent on numerous factors and hence may vary from actual speed. Clearly, Mr. President, it is difficult to penalize an internet provider that failed to deliver the advertised maximum speed. Would the gentleman agree that they should be penalized, or if they would be penalized, perhaps it's also difficult to penalize them if they don't have the capacity to measure this data, Mr. President, because I don't know if the gentleman have an updated data from NTC, but in looking at an article in 2017, mismong NTC po, sabi ho nila, hindi nila ma-implement yung isa nilang memorandum directing telecommunication companies to submit their average data connection rates. According to them, they could not ensure compliance since, and they admit this, since they did not have the appropriate measuring tools to verify those submissions. And they said they would only implement the circular in Metro Manila where they use rented measuring equipment. So, Mr. President, ito ay isang malaking hamon at malaking problema na tingin ko po ay dapat tutukan, and I'm glad that the distinguished gentleman from Cagayan de Oro raised this particular issue of not just the importance of having connectivity at home where we can work and for our children to continue their education, but also with regard to this misleading ads and internet speed.
Tama po yun, Mr. President. Actually, sinabihan ko nga si Senator Tolentino na ako mismo, hindi ko alam paano ba i-measure yung internet speed ng aking service provider. So, is that a separate gadget or is that an app? Is that a program? So, as we speed test, is that a program, an app? Is that just downloaded? So, as we grow in sophistication, because we're using the internet every day, so we will get to know all of this, and then consumers will get to know all of this.
We're only talking about consumers. What about the regulators? If they don't have the capacity to measure the number of Mbps, how can they regulate this service providers?
And I have a feeling that measurement of the speed from the point of view of the consumer must be different from the point of view of the regulator. Iba siguro sa kanila, because I think when you use the internet at the same time, I think that affects also the speed, no, from the point of view of the consumer.
Mr. President, last November 2020, during the budget deliberation of the Department of Information and Communications Technology, DICT proposed an increase on penalties, Mr. President. They proposed an increase on penalties on telecommunication companies for failure to deliver their advertised internet speeds. Mr. President, at present, based on the Public Service Act, Section 21, service providers are only imposed a 200 pesos fine per day of violation.
Okay.
In fact, DICT proposed that we increase this. In fact, they had the number, DICT proposed to increase this to 2 million pesos per day. Is there already a regulation drafted or released regarding this that the gentleman from Cagayan de Oro would know? Or
From the ICT, sir, I have no information. But at any rate, if this should this speech be referred to a committee, the committee hearing the subject matter should take into consideration the interpellation of the good gentleman and all of the points and questions raised. So, tanong na rin natin ito. Idagdag na rin po natin para recorded na po ito. Itong parang may nag-text din sa akin na paano daw yung mga time na hindi niya ma-access yung internet? Down, parang down, service down. So, down ang service ng internet provider. Is that being deducted to the monthly service fee? Wala yatang ganyan. There's no rule and there's no technique
Or
also
mechanism.
mechanism to determine how long it was down and to determine the amount to be subtracted from the monthly subscription fee. So maybe during the hearing, the resource persons can be asked to be prepared to respond to the points that we have raised, Mr. President.
thank you, Mr. President, and I agree with the gentleman from Cagayan de Oro that we all know that one of the basic rules in consumer rights is that goods and services must be fit for purpose of satisfactory quality and as described, Mr. President, no, para hindi tayo nagogoyo. Another thing, Mr. President, before I end, is the issue that concerns bandwidth throttling, Mr. President. I'm not a techie person. When you talk about bandwidth throttling or the act where the internet provider is deliberately slowing down the internet service, perhaps to maximize profits, perhaps to expand their services, especially in cases where it has detected too much usage or traffic. The question I'd like to pose to the good gentleman who is also our bar top notcher here in the Senate is this legal, Mr. President?
Well, actually, Mr. President, that's the first time I have heard of that term.
Bandwidth throttling.
So, we'll just study it after this exchange, Mr. President. But of course, that's why I asked myself, can that be done? I mean, technically, can that be done? So can they intentionally slow down the speed of the internet or their internet service? If the answer is yes, and they are doing this intentionally, despite the advertisement or the come on to get the consumers that this is the speed, and then they're doing that, playing around with the speed. I think offhand I can say that there must be some violation of either the consumer laws or advertising laws, Mr. President.
Thank you.
That means that the topic or the practice, this phenomenon needs further study, Mr. President.
Yes, and our regulators should step up, Mr. President. Perhaps, and we hope that our regulators, such as the Philippine Competition Commission, would look into this. We heard that under certain circumstances, bandwidth throttling can be considered an issue, Mr. President, of abuse of dominant position. So I hope that we will be able to raise this at the proper time at the committee level. And one last thing that I'd like to raise, Mr. President, the issue of contracting of internet companies. I remember when we were tackling the issue of end of contract or ENDO, some companies would always say, oh, it is not part of our mother company. It is a subcontracting company. And again, I'm not questioning the business model of subcontracting. I'm sure it is legal, and we continue to promote subcontracting for obvious reasons, Mr. President. But on the issue of internet services, Mr. President, and this is another personal experience that this representation had when we asked for service for a particular internet service provider. A certain contractor came in and they started asking us to buy, for example, peripherals, cables, etc. And if you don't agree with them, you would have to go to the mother company or to the internet provider, and it will take hundreds of years again for you to get a schedule for this internet workers or subcontractors to fix your internet cables, Mr. President. So may I know the gentleman's perspective on this particular sector of internet connectivity with regard to subcontracting, Mr. President?
Well, the internet service provider, just like any vendor of a certain item or a service, must always have in mind the policy of keeping their customers happy and make sure that they have what is called after-sale service efficient, and then not use the fact that it's a third party, contracted third party which provides the service, because that's supposed to be part of the relationship now of the internet service provider with the consumer. So if this if this contracting method is also now being used to avoid or evade some of the responsibilities or obligations of the internet service provider, then I think if this is also now a pervasive practice, then I think we should also take a look at this. Because if you enter into a business, make sure that the consumers, the market, is pleased not only with the goods or services that you have sold, but with the totality of the experiences in the consumer's dealings with you.
Yes.
I mean that should now be the more modern approach in doing business, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I agree with the distinguished gentleman from Cagayan de Oro City that accountability is a must. No, whenever they come here, for instance, in Congress and ask for a franchise, and we give the franchise, etc. We trust that they would deliver and not hide or point out their subcontractors as the ones not giving a satisfactory service, Mr. President.
Pero sir, Mr. President, maybe that practice was only copied from practice in other industries, like ginagawa ba yan sa cable? Ginawa ba yan sa landline noon? Ganun ba yan?
Well, most probably, Mr. President, I might not be able to pinpoint which particular sectors they are doing this, but in my personal experience, this is what I experienced the past few months, Mr. President. In fact, these subcontractors would even go out of their way and give you a good sales stock, Mr. President, for you to buy this and that without the knowledge of the mother company. So again, Mr. President,
and may I interject? and the consumer never in the first place dealt with them. The consumer dealt with the
Yes,
with
in
the
fact, Mr.
internet service
President,
provider.
if you are to pay the subcontractors, you need to pay the mother company, the company that contracted this subcontracting firm. So, again, that is the main reason why I am raising this particular issue. Again, I will no longer belabor the issue. I'd like to thank the distinguished gentleman from Cagayan de Oro for listening and entertaining these representations questions. I know and I believe that a lot of our kababayans are interested in these particular issues. The concerns po ito, Mr. President, ng ating mga workers, concerns po ito ng mga workers natin na nagwo-work from home, yung mga estudyante po natin na nag-aaral sa kanilang mga bahay. So maraming salamat, Ginoong Pangulo, at sa ating distinguished colleague. God bless us all.
Mr. President, Senator Villanueva. Thank you.
Mr. President.
Mr. President, Senator Grace Poe would like to be recognized.
Senator Grace Poe is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd just like to react to the privileged speech of our colleague from Cagayan de Oro. I would like to thank him for bringing out this exciting possibility. I also had a briefing earlier this morning with the representatives of SpaceX, and as pointed out by our colleague, there are certain issues that are that need to be addressed with regards to the possibility of opening up a player in the technology that they are offering, which is satellite technology for connectivity. Mr. President, as mentioned by our colleague, the cost at this point is quite prohibitive for the regular subscriber. It's about, and I'd like to mention it again, it's about $500 just to set this up. So it's about 25,000 pesos. And then after that, there's an additional cost, which will be higher than what other subscribers are paying to the other telcos that they are now subscribing to. Now, having said that, that's not necessarily a bad thing later on, because there's probably a niche market that will be able to afford this technology. And we're also looking forward that in the future, with more subscribers, the costs will go down. Bababa rin pag marami ng subscribers. Of course, we are hoping that will happen. But in the meantime, that will be a big concern, is the cost. Number two, as also mentioned by the colleague, and I'd like to reiterate, the ownership provisions in our Constitution is discouraging for other investors, particularly this one of SpaceX. The 60-40 ownership is a concern for them. So I don't think they're willing to partner up if they don't have any control, because number one, of course, it's technology sensitive, and a lot of the technology or the technical data involved here is probably patented to them. So they may not be able to share it with the owners if some of them are of foreign status. So these are two very important issues: ownership, number one, and number two, cost. Now, another thing that was raised by another colleague from Bulacan is the cost of the penalties to the telcos. That is true. That's why we had this hearing on the minimum internet speed. One of the things that came out in the meeting is that, number one, the penalties are too low, so it will not be a prevention from other telco companies to keep violating. It won't prevent them. It won't discourage them from violating, because, as mentioned, 200 pesos is the penalty. In the bill that we have now, we are trying to increase that to 2 million pesos, and that they should at least deliver a high percentage of their maximum advertised standard. So, for example, they advertise 300 Mbps. At least, if I'm not mistaken, 80% of the time, that's the service speed that you should receive. So hopefully we can pass this bill soon enough so that the telcos will be compelled to act. Now, with regards to the connection that we had when we had the SIM card registration hearing, we have experienced ourselves the difficulty of conducting online hearings because of the intermittent signal. And what happened at the time was my signal was pretty bad, and I was chairing the committee. And well, thankfully, the company that provides my broadband service came immediately within less than 30 minutes. And they said that they would increase my broadband speed, which they did, and I'm grateful. I'm just hoping that they can also be this quick in addressing the concerns of the public who are complaining perhaps about their internet speed. As I was just talking about this, makita ko, parang nababawasan din yung signal ko. So parang, ewan ko kung nasasabotahin na naman tayo dito. Hindi sa nag-iinsulto, ang sinasabi ko lang salamat na pinataas yung internet speed ko. At sabi ko nga dun sa hearing namin, sana all, di ba? Sabi nga ni Senator Marcos, at sana always. Di ba? So,
Sana all, always.
Oo, sana all, at sana always. Now, I would also like to say that, of course, we would like to associate ourselves with a company like SpaceX with a very innovative culture headed by Elon Musk. And I would hope that we can probably find a solution, not in overhauling the Constitution itself, but with the passage of the Public Service Act, which will increase or which will allow foreign ownership in certain industries. Because with that, hindi na naman tayo pag-iwanan. Just in our Viber group, somebody sent the news that this year, in Vietnam, the citizens of Vietnam will actually be richer than us. That is quite sad kung napapag-iwanan na naman tayo dahil sa mga desisyon na hindi natin nagawa agad o ayaw nating gawin dahil lamang merong mga iba na pumipigil. Ilang beses ng maraming mga development projects ang urong-sulong dahil mabagal ang approval. Kaya sana sa panahon na ito ay gumawa tayo ng aksyon na mga ganitong uri ng kumpanya ay maaaring mamuhunan sa ating bansa. Pero hindi gawing hostage ang ating konstitusyon. Yun lamang po. Maraming salamat.
Senator Pablo Lacson is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. The issue I wish to discuss with the distinguished gentleman from Cagayan de Oro is on the legal complications and possible constitutional restrictions, as you mentioned in your privilege speech, if you're willing to
Yes, sir.
just possibly a couple of questions. Now, does your research include the availability and access to mobile satellite equipment here in the Philippines as we speak?
Our research led us to, number one, the Constitution, the RA 7925, Public Telecommunications Policy Act of the Philippines,
Mr. President,
and also the Radio Control Act, sir. So only to those laws, but
my question is, as we speak, do you know of any similar satellite installed that's actually operating in the country?
providing internet access. Sir,
Yes, communication.
Communication.
I asked that question,
Yes, sir.
Mr. President, because I came across an article about the Inmarsat, a UK space agency and a consortium of local NGO partners that have already institutionalized satellite communications into disaster response mechanisms in the country, regularly hit by natural disasters. The point I'm trying to raise, Mr. President, is if they can do it, as apparently they're actually doing it right now without being confronted by legal, with any legal challenge. Maybe when we can find out how Inmarsat did it, which is a UK space agency and its consortium of local NGO partners, operate the same,
Yes,
Mr.
sir.
President.
Thank
So-
you. Yes, Mr. President, I would like to thank Senator Lacson for bringing that out. But probably the key idea there is with local NGO partners. So that is what we need to find out. What is the partnership agreement with Inmarsat, admittedly a foreign corporation,
UK
a United
space agency.
Kingdom owned corporation, partnering with local, when you say local, Philippine NGOs.
Yes.
Yes, siguro sir, they can explain to us the
That's
relationship, the details of the relationship, the mechanics of the relationship.
Whether it's a business relationship or
Yes.
only for purposes of
Disaster.
addressing disaster
Yes, sir.
in the country.
Yes, sir.
It further states that field offices are now operating mobile satellite communication equipment, which makes use of Inmarsat Global Express system of satellites. So it's already here, Mr. President. We only need to find out kung ano yung mga legal
Yes,
maneuvers na ginawa nila, if these are maneuvers. Because I suppose these are registered entities under the Philippine laws. I'm not sure, again, I'm not sure if it's for business,
Yes, sir.
if it's a business partnership or just for the purpose of addressing calamities, Mr. President. So maybe it's worth looking into.
Yes, sir. Yes, I agree. So thank you for bringing that up. So we will have to look at the Inmarsat experience. Yun po. Whenever or wherever this matter is heard, if we could invite Inmarsat representative or the NGO partners to share with us how they were able to do it
At the proper time, Mr.
Yes, sir.
President.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, sir.
That's all.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, my dear colleagues.
All right, Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I move that the speech of the gentleman from Cagayan de Oro be referred to the Public Services Committee as primary committee and the Committee on Trade and Commerce as the secondary committee. So moved, Mr. President.
All right, hearing no objection, the privileged speech is hereby referred to the Committee on Public Services and the Committee on Trade.
Thank you, Mr. President. Before we tackle our other measures on the floor, if I may be allowed to report out to the plenary, Mr. President, our rules meeting that we had last Monday morning together with Senator Franklin Drilon, our minority floor leader, and some members of our panel. If I may be
By all means.
allowed. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, we are happy to report that the Committee on Rules, upon the meeting yesterday morning, that was yesterday morning, we're only Tuesday, I thought we were Wednesday. Yesterday morning, Mr. President, has resolved standing concerns regarding our legislative priorities, particularly the possible conflict between Senate Bill number 244, or the Right Sizing of National Government Act, authored by no less than our dear Senate President, Senator Soto, and the bills regarding the creation of new agencies such as the Department of Overseas Filipinos, the Department of Disaster Resilience, and Department of Culture, and Department of Water Management. This issue was brought forth last year by our esteemed Minority Leader, Senator Frank Drilon, who motioned that the hearing of the proposed Overseas Filipino Department be deferred until which the bill between right sizing and our new agencies, creating various departments and agencies, be prioritized to be heard by the respective committees is settled. And I thank our dear Minority Floor Leader because we had worked together on this, on how we can move forward and discuss a win-win solution for our Senate and as well as the committees. In yesterday's meeting, we came to an agreement, Mr. President, to resolve this by honoring the Senate's long-standing tradition of honoring the committee system, which means we are allowing bills to be taken up by the respective committees simultaneously. Then, once the committee reports are filed, we will call for an all-member caucus, and this is a commitment I made to the minority, to our dear Minority Floor Leader. Once the committee reports are filed, through an all-member caucus, we can discuss how we may prioritize these bills in the legislative calendar for plenary deliberation. As your Majority Floor Leader, Mr. President, I take pride in consensus building. I do not dictate to our colleagues. I always ask our colleagues their priorities, and of course, the priorities of the chamber. By practice and tradition, Mr. President, we have always been given the committee. We've always given the committees, rather, their own prerogative in handling matters referred to them. And since all the bills in question are still at the committee level, we cannot truly determine yet if the reports will actually be in conflict, Mr. President, or even be taken up at all, even in the committee level. Our legislative calendar for plenary discussion is a matter entirely, Mr. President, for which there's no explicit policy in our rules on how bills are to be prioritized for plenary debates. Although there's Section 36 in Rule 13 of our Senate rules, your majority leader is always guided by the consensus among our members. We will defer to the body's collective wisdom and discretion regarding the prioritization of these bills for our plenary discussions. We trust that the committee reports will guide us in coming to a decision regarding which bills, Mr. President, needs to be taken up on the floor first. We thank our minority floor leader. I truly thank him, Mr. President, for his wisdom and for his guidance and always alerting the chamber to possible policy issues like this. It is important that we are able to review these types of situations so we can resolve them and proceed with clarity and certainty. We also like to thank Senator Joel Villanueva, who chairs the Committee on Labor, for which the proposed Department of Overseas Filipinos is lodged on, and was actually the impetus for this discussion. Mr. President, Senator Joel has been a real champion of our OFWs, and I'm sure the good gentleman is raring to resume committee work on the DOFIL bills, or the Department of Overseas Filipinos. Siya talaga ang araw-araw tumutulak nito, Mr. President, because not only is he interested in this measure, I know Bulacan, the great province of Bulacan, and the great provinces of Central Luzon, which areas he represents, is full of families from overseas Filipino workers. So again, we thank the members of the Rules Committee, and we wish our concerned and affected committees the best of luck as you resume your work on those bills, on your bills, remembering always that over everything else, the priority of the Senate, Mr. President, is to look after the welfare of the Filipino people. Maraming salamat po, Mr. President.
All right, we place on record the report made by the majority leader as chairman of the Committee on Rules.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. With that, I move that we resume consideration, if our dear colleague Senator Francis Tolentino is ready. We resume consideration on the discussions of House Bill number 6598. This is in the period of amendments, Mr. President. I so move.
Any objection? Hearing none, consideration is in order.
This is the
Status is period of
period
amendments.
of amendments na po tayo,
Alright.
Mr. President.
Alright.
And this is the conversion of the municipality of Calaca and the province of Batangas to a component city, Mr. President. May we recognize the sponsor, Senator Francis Tolentino, and I believe he owes the good minority floor leader, I believe, an explanation on a particular request of our minority floor leader. Mr. President, may we recognize Senator Tolentino.
Senator Tolentino is recognized.
Thank you,
And the
Mr.
minority leader, go ahead. Minority
you.
leader is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Pursuant to the request of our minority leader, I forwarded to his office the opinion required as contained in our journal, and I quote that the good minority leader will not have additional questions and would await for the final opinion of Senator Tolentino on the issue of the allocation of development fund. Mr. President, I forwarded on even date the said required opinion, giving a copy thereof to the majority leader likewise. And basically the contents of the opinion, Mr. President, is that the twin cases cited might not be applicable to the Calaca bill because the issue under consideration is in section 12 is merely directory, as the word may was used when Calaca was, if converted into a city, was given a direct discretionary option to use a portion of their funds for environmental protection purposes, Mr. President. And with the permission of the minority leader, the opinion mentioned a while ago would be part of the records of this proceeding, Mr. President. So I will turn over a copy to the Secretariat, Mr. President. And for the information of the body, your committee will no longer pursue committee amendments and will embrace the expanse and legal attributes of House Bill 6598 as submitted and contained in Committee Report number 154, Mr. President.
The minority leader is recognized. Senator Drilon.
Thank you very much to the gentleman from Cavite for spreading into the record the interpretation of that particular provision in the proposed charter of Calaca, of the city of Calaca. Just to spread into the record that the provision on the allocation of 10% for environmental concerns is not an obligation or allocation of the funds of Calaca. It is only discretionary on the part of the city council whether or not such allocation will be done in their annual budget. Is that a correct interpretation, sir?
That's a correct interpretation, Mr. President.
Yes. On that basis, Mr. President, we are satisfied that indeed we are not running afoul with the decisions of the Supreme Court, which prohibits national government from interfering in the disposition of the ERA and the local funds generated by the local government units, since the good sponsor has said that the provision in the proposed charter of Calaca will only, is not an obligatory obligation or allocation of local government funds or the ERA, but only a suggestion addressed to the better judgment and discretion of the city council. Is that correct, sir?
That's correct, Your Honor. It's merely persuasive in character, Your Honor, Mr. President.
Which is persuasive, Your Honor? The provision of the law?
No. The discretionary meaning of the word may is a suggestion to the future City Council of Calaca that they may use, if they want, if the proper need arises, to allocate 10% for the protection of the environment of Calaca.
Just a final question. If they do not allocate the 10%, they are not violating the charter.
Yes, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. With those clarifications, we have no further question. We have no objection to the passage of this bill and would endorse its approval at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you to the minority leader as well for his wisdom and guidance in shepherding this bill. Thank you, Mr. President. No, as I mentioned, Mr. President, your committee will no longer propose amendments.
With that, Mr. President, and the people of Calacar have been waiting for this moment. Mr. President, I move to close the period of amendments on this measure. I so move, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, period of amendments closed.
With that, Mr. President, I move that we approve on second reading House Bill number 6598. I so move.
Any objection? Chair hears none. House Bill 6598 is approved on second reading.
Congratulations to the people of Calaca and to our chairperson, Mr. President. I move that we suspend consideration to act on third reading on Monday.
Consideration of the measures suspended.
Thank you, Mr. President. Next online in our agenda, Mr. President, is
with the
bill
permission,
on...
with the permission of our majority leader and the Senate President.
Yes, sir. May we recognize our Senate
Senator
President
Ralph
Pro Tem.
Recto, President Pro Tem is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Majority Leader. I'd just like to thank our sponsor, the chairman of the committee who sponsored this measure, and the minority leader, and all our colleagues for supporting this measure, for passing the fifth city in the province of Batangas. Maraming salamat sa inyo. Thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Congratulations,
And
Senator Recto.
congratulations to our dear colleague from Batangas, a new city. And rightly so, it is in an area of the first district. Wala pa pong silang syudad dun, so that'll be great that there's a city in the first district of Batangas. Mr. President, we'd like to resume consideration of Senate Bill number 1886. This is the jurisdiction of the Metropolitan Trial Courts. So, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none. 1886 consideration is in order.
Mr. President, I move that we recognize our distinguished colleague from Zambales, Senator Richard Gordon, and as well our minority floor leader for his amendments, Mr. President.
Senator Richard Gordon, gentleman from Zambales, is recognized. To interpolate is the minority leader, Senator Franklin.
I think I'm sorry, Mr. President, we were already in the period of amendments. So the motion is to open the period of amendments, Mr. President.
All
I
right, the
apologize.
motion is for the parliamentary status. Motion is for the period of amendments to be open. Any objection? Hearing none, period of amendments open.
Give me the, no, sorry, Pats.
Senator Gordon, Mr. President, is to sponsor. And
Yes,
I believe
Senator Gordon is a sponsor, and any committee amendments?
None, Your Honor. I was waiting for the amendments of Senator Jordan at the moment.
But Senator Aquilino Pimentel III is seeking
Just
the
to
floor.
clarify
You're
the-
recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. To clarify the parliamentary status of this measure, I think the last time Senator Drilon proposed an amendment to Section 3, to which proposal I expressed some grave reservation, Mr. President, and I think we agreed to step on the brakes, have a couple of days to think about the proposed amendment of Senator Drilon, which basically is about, if you remember correctly, delegating the power of the legislature to apportion the jurisdiction of the courts to the Supreme Court. So I have expressed my grave reservation, and upon researching on the matter, my reservation remains, Mr. President, especially when I saw that the apportionment of the jurisdiction of the jurisdiction of the courts is actually even mentioned in the Constitution as a legislative power. So, maybe I will appeal to the proponent if he has had a change of mind or heart after the passage of a few days. Thank you, Mr. President.
Yes, the gentleman from Cagayan de Oro is correct. That was the status when we suspended consideration. Senator Franklin is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. There is no dispute that the power to allocate the jurisdictions of the inferior courts, particularly the first level and the second level courts, is a power vested by the Constitution to Congress. However, there is also nothing in the Constitution which prohibits Congress from delegating this function to the Supreme Court, who is in a better position to judge whether or not to reallocate the jurisdictional amounts found in the Judiciary Act. As a reality, Mr. President, you have been in the Senate for 4 terms, if I may recall, and in every instance that we reallocate the jurisdictional amounts between the second and the third, or the first and the second level courts, we consult the Supreme Court. We never inserted any provision on jurisdiction without the concurrence of the Supreme Court as a respect to the co-equal branch. So that is a practical matter. And it is the Supreme Court who drafts or who decides on the jurisdictional amounts. It is on this basis that we thought that the Supreme Court, having supervision over our court system, should be given that delegated authority. Therefore, we have proposed that the jurisdictional amounts should be the determination of the jurisdictional amounts of the first and second level courts should be delegated to the Supreme Court. Let me assure the gentleman that we have consulted the constitutional experts on this issue and have expressed no objection to this proposal. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Mr. President,
As I have expressed I think this was tackled last Wednesday, even if we assume that the proposed amendment is constitutional for complying with the requirements of a valid delegation of legislative power, for example, there is still, after the question of constitutionality kasi is the question of whether it is a wise policy. So question of wisdom. So even if, let's say, we assume that the proposed amendment is entirely or 100% constitutional, I also express the opinion that I would rather not have the legislature delegate such a power mentioned in the Constitution as a basic legislative power to not delegate this to the Supreme Court. So this is no longer a question of whether it is constitutional, it is a question of whether we should do it. So wisdom na po or policy. So I've just expressed my position on the matter, Mr. President. At any rate, the minority leader is of course more experienced in lawmaking, but at any rate, maybe we can make this a separate subject matter of a bill so that we can study the concept more deeply and the debate on it more thoroughly. At any rate, the section 3 of the measure that we are considering already provides for the parang automatic adjustment of the jurisdictional amounts every 5 years. And on this section, where I express some reservation initially, upon revisiting it and studying it more carefully, I have no reservation or objection to section 3 of the committee report, which allows the automatic adjustment naman, sir, of the jurisdictional amounts. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Mr. President.
yes, the sponsor is recognized.
Mr. President, I have a lot of respect for what the two gentlemen have stated. Both seem to have some sound reasoning behind their arguments. However, Mr. President, we are in an era where justice has crawled so slowly, Mr. President. And for an example, as I pointed out in my presentation, the last time we amended the jurisdiction was in 2004, which meant that a lot of people had to wait for their cases to be called simply because we have a rational the Supreme Court, or for that matter, the judiciary, can move a little faster. Dapat bilisan naman natin ng konti because yan ang hinihingi ng ating mga kababayan. Now, insofar as constitutionality is concerned, Senator Dillon and I had been talking about it over the weekend, and he consulted his own friends who are constitutionalists, and I did so too, Mr. President. After all, I have classmates who were former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and their position is that it is a valid delegation of authority because there is still that phrase, unless otherwise provided for by law. In other words, we're not surrendering the prerogatives of the legislature in toto to the Supreme Court. This is really more of a pragmatic solution right now, which allows us to be nimble, and the Supreme Court to be nimble and fleet-footed as well when they say overloaded na. And therefore, if it's overloaded, not because it's overloaded, they come up with a cogent division, Mr. President, that I think is acceptable. So they bring down the load of the Supreme Court, of the second level court, and give it some to the first level court, and in the process, the public will go, the process of law will go faster. Besides, Mr. President, this will be prospective anyway. So hindi naman basta i-unload, parang in-unload ng dump truck. No? So ito ay magagamit kagad. On the other hand, we also observed some precedents in the past, Mr. President. And let me quote, this is on the matter of the Eastern shipping lines test, Mr. President, where this was taken up. And the court ruled that the occasions are rare when executive or judicial powers have to be delegated by the authorities to which they legally certain. And in the case of the legislative power, however, such occasions have become more and more frequent. If not necessary, they have led to the observation that the delegation of legislative authority has become the rule and its non-delegation the exception. That's in the case of Eastern Shipping Lines, Mr. President, when a widow of a Filipino sailor who died was seeking assistance from the shipping line, and the POA intervened and said, we'll give it to you because normally it should be given by SSS. And in the course of this, the Supreme Court said, pwede yung POEA because talaga naman kasama yan sa charter nila. And at the same time, memorandum for death benefits are included with POEA. So why will you further exacerbate the suffering of the widow? That's one case, Your Honor. But really, upon the other hand, we really have to take a look at the reason of the increasing complexity, Mr. President, of the task of government. As you can see earlier, we were discussing Tesla. And it seems that we're trying to stay up apace of the changing world. And the growing inability of the legislature is more pronounced to cope directly with the myriad problems demanding its attention. Certainly, the court will be made aware of the fact that the pace of justice is turning slow. Now, my personal thrust, and you may not agree with it, is to make sure that the Justice Committee, your committee, comes out with things that will speed up the administration of justice. That's why we allowed for time spent community service and made it arresto mayor the threshold to allow people to be released. We also are creating courts, Mr. President, judges at large, and we're also increasing some of the courts, if I'm not mistaken. I think I'm handling one of them right now. And even unloading the courts of various cases. I'm going to file a bill on police courts, Mr. President, so that people will see which court is handling police cases. The thrust, therefore, Mr. President, is to see to it that the people become more aware of the fleet-footedness of the judiciary. Para nakikita nila na mabilis na ang takbo. To many of the problems attendant that you may not have the competence the required. I'm sure this is just a way of saying it, but I know we do have the confidence, but we are not as nimble to get a law passed. You have to get two sides of the Congress to agree. So in this particular instance, and I emphasize particular instance, we're allowing the court at our discretion, subject to our pulling it out later on if we change our mind under the provision unless otherwise provided for by law, that we can now say, fine. Also, there is that every 5 years, although the Supreme Court can make that review, so much so that if there is still an overloading, then they can act nimbly. So, Mr. President, the important thing is that we allow ourselves the required direct and efficacious, not to say specific solutions, in a very expeditious manner. Having said that, Mr. President, I'd like to remain steadfast on our provision. This is the meat, the body and soul of this bill, Mr. President, and we have studied it on committee. And I think it's now time to take the chance to delegate that power, albeit temporarily, and I would not see it wasted by making another appeal to delegate it, Mr. President. I think it's important that we act fast. Thank you very much, Mr. President, and with my apologies to my good friend Senator Pimentel, who I know speaking out of principle, Mr. President. We too speak out of principle. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Gordon. So,
Mr. President,
Senator Francis Tolentino is
Mr.
recognized.
President, just a short manifestation in support of the position of Senator Pimentel. Mr. President, the powers of Congress is very clear relative to the Judicial Department as contained in Article 8, Section 2 of the Constitution. And I quote, "The Congress shall have the power to define, prescribe, and apportion the jurisdiction of the various courts, Mr. President." Nowhere in the language of the Constitution can we find an intent or a textual content that would allow Congress to share the powers with the judiciary, Mr. President. So in effect, Mr. President, and with all due respect, this would be tantamount to abdicating the powers of Congress to another branch of government which is not contained in the Constitution, Mr. President. It cannot be found in the Constitution that powers given by the Constitution to Congress can be delegated to the judiciary in this specific issue, Mr. President. It is not a rule-making power that will be received by the Supreme Court. It will be a delegated power, which is, my submission is that it is forbidden because it cannot be found in the language, heart, and intent of the Constitution. That's all my manifestation is, Mr. President. I support the position of Senator Aquilino Pimentel. Thank you, Mr. President.
Answer, Mr. President.
Yes, Senator Gordon is recognized.
The general appearance is that really, indeed, the Congress has the power to define, prescribe, and apportion the jurisdiction of various courts, and but may not deprive the Supreme Court of its jurisdiction over cases enumerated in Section 5. Now, first and foremost, Mr. President, the suggestion we came from the Supreme Court. It did not come out from our mind, but they were asking us kung pwedeng make the adjustments because masyado na ang pressure. On the other hand, there's also the next provision, the subsequent provision, which provides that the Supreme Court shall have administrative supervision over all courts and the personnel thereof, which means they know in the administration of justice that their personnel are sandbagged by numerous cases already, Mr. President. And besides, Mr. President, it is important to note that this power is not permanently being relinquished by the Congress. The phrase "unless otherwise provided for by law" is our insurance. At some point in time, when things are normalized, we can do that. I don't think it would be a sin to allow the Supreme Court some more leeway because they know from time to time how heavy the caseload can be. It's beginning, for example, to be more difficult to get judges, Mr. President. I sit in the Judicial Bar Council, Mr. President. The applicants, for example, Mr. President, have taken the bar 3 times, 4 times. Talagang humihirap makakuha ng mga abogado. And Mr. President, in this particular instance, I will quote in the case of Edu versus Ericta, the legislature does not abdicate its function, and I emphasize that we're not abdicating its function when it describes what job must be done, who is to do it, and what is the scope of this authority. For a complex economy, that may indeed be the only way in which the legislative process can go forward, Mr. President. And that is why I think we're not abdicating to anything. And the Supreme Court is not jumping with joy that we are relinquishing a power because they know we're not. What they would like us to do is give them an assist so that they can move faster. And besides, Mr. President, if there is a question made by my distinguished colleagues in the Supreme Court, they would have to decide it anyway. And if they do decide it, then we are going into a new law, Mr. President. And I think that that would be better rather than having all these cases languish before judges that cannot move because they are simply overloaded. I submit, Your Honor.
Yes, the Majority Leader.
Yes, Mr. President, I know I believe there is a dispute on one particular amendment which we may have to decide as a body. May I ask for a 1-minute suspension, Mr. President? I am not a legal luminary. We want to ask our legal luminaries what this issue is all about before we can act on the motion or to divide the House or to make a decision collectively, Mr. President. May we ask
Alright.
for 1 minute suspension?
Yes, so the session is suspended for 1 Senate minute. Session resumed.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. President. I believe the break that we had in the lounge was able to give us an idea of the discussion at hand with the measure on the Metropolitan Trial Courts, Mr. President, thoroughly discussed by our two legal experts, Senator Coco Pimentel, as well as Senator Francis Tol Tolentino, and yung kung sa Bisaya pa, murag abogado, na parang abogado, our Senate President and Senator Ping Lacson was a lot of lawyer friends. So, Mr. President, during the discussion, we have an idea, more or less, the two sides of the measure. But maybe just recognize Senator Coco Pimentel, Mr. President. I believe he has a last-ditch appeal to put on record.
Yes, okay. The parliamentary status is that we're still in the period of amendments, and we suspended because of a pending amendment that is being asked, a question by Senator Pimentel. Senator Pimentel, you may continue. You are
Thank you, Mr. President. To the best of my ability, I think this is the situation. There is a proposed amendment to Section 3 of the measure found in the committee report. And the essence of the proposed amendment is a delegation of the legislative power to apportion the jurisdiction of courts to the Supreme Court for in the future, so that the Supreme Court can adjust the amounts which determine jurisdiction of the MTC and the RTC. And then there have been two grave reservations expressed regarding the proposed amendment. One is constitutional, that the wording of the amendment, the terms of the delegation, and the concept of the delegation itself may be unconstitutional. The other one, which I added, my reservation is a policy reservation, in the sense that even if we assume that the proposed amendment is perfectly constitutional, it's a policy question. The wisdom behind the proposal, should we delegate such a power, which is mentioned in the Constitution explicitly as belonging to the legislature. So this is the situation, Mr. President. I think Senator Tolentino will correct me if I'm wrong. He raises the constitutional angle. I raise the policy question, whether we should do it or not. I find it unwise to do it. So that's my appeal to our colleagues or to the proponent. Because it's about the wisdom. If we could, take a second or third look at the proposal. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Pimentel. Senator Francis Tolentino is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just to add up to the parliamentary conversation, Mr. President, I am likewise, again, in support of the proposition of the gentleman from Cagayan de Oro, that we might be treading on dangerous, dark alleys that would trip us into unconstitutionality, Mr. President. With all due respect to the sponsor, I cite 4 cases coming from the Supreme Court that would probably allow us to reflect on whether the actions that we will be taking will be, 1, a delegation of a power given to us by the Constitution to another co-equal branch of government. It is not sharing. It is a total abdication of that power granted solely to Congress by the Constitution. And number 2, we will be depriving future Congresses, future Senates, of that power likewise, because once we have abandoned and given up that power, we might not be able to retrieve it back, Mr. President. I cite, Mr. President, a 1967 case of De Jesus versus Garcia, GR 26816, February 28, 1971, which in its dicta states, Congress may not delegate powers vested on it by the Constitution, specifically when it reflects the jurisdiction of courts. The ruling states, and I quote, the constitutional authority of the Supreme Court is circumscribed in the zone properly denominated as the promulgation of rules concerning pleading, practice, and procedure in all courts, and admission to the practice of law, and consequently to determine the means and ways or manner in which said jurisdiction, as fixed by the Constitution and acts of Congress, shall be exercised. The Supreme Court, Mr. President, and probably through overtures and through informal manners, came to Congress, came to us, to ask for an expansion of the expansion of their jurisdiction over metropolitan courts. By coming to us, Mr. President, the Supreme Court is acknowledging that we have the power to expand the jurisdiction of the metropolitan trial courts, municipal trial courts in cities, municipal trial courts, and this is now the product of that overture, Senate Bill 1886. It shows, Mr. President, that the Supreme Court, in its wisdom, and it's in the acknowledgement that the power is lodged with Congress, is bowing to the legislative will that we have the power. That is why we are now discussing this measure. And by virtue of this measure, we will be, if approved, expanding the jurisdiction of the MTC and other first-level courts by giving them the power to adjust the amounts involved. Would be another expansion of power given not to Congress, but given to the co-equal branch who came to us at this very instant. So it is there, Mr. President, that's the reason why I mentioned the word abdication. In the case of UST versus the Board of Tax Appeals, GR L5701, June 23, 1957, a very old case, it explicitly ruled, and this has something to do with the powers of the Chief Executive in redefining the functions of the Board of Tax Appeals. The Chief Executive cannot, nor can that power be delegated by Congress, for under our Constitution, Congress alone has the power to define, prescribe, and apportion the jurisdiction of the various courts. Jurisdiction, again, as related to the Senate Bill 1886 under consideration, is reflective of the amount that we are discussing, Mr. President. In another similar case, Director of Forestry versus Ruiz, GRL 24882, April 30, 1971. The Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution lodges with Congress, quote unquote, quote, the power to define, prescribe, and apportion the jurisdiction of various courts, unquote. It just shows, Mr. President, that the Supreme Court acknowledges the powers lodged with Congress, with the Senate, a legislative act enacted pursuant to a constitutional mandate defining the jurisdiction of courts in matters of quo warranto, habeas corpus, for instance, is an act made pursuant to the Constitution. In another case, Mr. President, Zamora versus Court of Appeals, nothing in the jurisdiction which was decided March 19, 1990, GR 78206. Nothing can change the jurisdiction of the court over the subject matter. But Congress has the sole power to define, prescribe, and apportion the jurisdiction of various courts. Unquote, Mr. President. It just goes to show, Mr. President, that we have the powers. The Constitution gave us the powers. The Constitution gave Congress the powers to legislate. We cannot give that legislative function to the executive branch. We cannot give that function to the judiciary, even if it will be proven efficient. In the same manner, the Supreme Court gave the judiciary the power to decide cases. Under the Constitution, Mr. President, I stand corrected. But the Supreme Court cannot give us the power to decide cases.
Did you?
Again, Mr. President, the Constitution gives the executive the power to execute the laws.
Sabi ni Frank.
But the Constitution never gave us the power to implement the laws and decide, Mr. President. This is the essence of separation of powers, Mr. President. It is very fundamental to our democracy such that it was lodged and structured in such a way that there will be checks and balances, Mr. President. There will be no more checks and balances if we delegate a function of Congress to the Supreme Court because they will be legislating. There will be no more checks and balances if we give the legislative power to the executive because they will be legislating. It is very similar to the heart and core of my privileged speech months ago concerning the implementing rules, Mr. President, that the executive branch has been straying on the legislative functions of Congress by implementing, and they have been usurping the legislative functions because of their implementing rules, Mr. President, which has gone beyond the legislative acts of Congress. Now, in this instance, Mr. President, we are giving away a chunk of the legislative function given to us by the Constitution. Sa atin po binigay yung trabaho ng saligang batas na i-determine kung magkano ba ang dapat na pumasok doon sa jurisdiction ng municipal trial courts. Kung ibibigay po natin yan sa Supreme Court, sila na po yung gagawa ng batas. Kaya po binigay sa atin yan kasi alam po ng gumawa ng saligang batas na ang mga miyembro ng Kongreso, ang miyembro ng Senado, alam po yung nangyayari sa baba. Alam po nila yung problema ng mga litigants. Alam po nila yung problema ng mga nagdidemanda sa mga bayan, sa mga munisipyo at mga lungsod. At alam po nila kung ano yung problema tungkol sa mga filing fees. Doon din po karamihan kumihingi sa mga gobernador, sa mayor ng pandagdag. At alam po nila, alam po ng gumawa ng saligang batas na mas malapit ang Kongreso sa taong bayan kesa po sa mga miyembro ng judiciary who are detached, unelected, and not accountable to the people. The members of the legislative branch are elected by the people, attached to the people, and are accountable to the people. Mr. President, in the case of Edu versus Ericta, GR number L3296, decided October 24, 1970 by the Supreme Court. It is a fundamental principle flowing from the doctrine of separation of powers that Congress may not delegate its legislative power to the two other branches of government, Mr. President, subject only to one exemption, that local governments may over local affairs participate in its exercise. That's why we have the local government code, Mr. President. So it is very clear from the cases I mentioned, and I have a lot of other cases. I do not want to take too much time of this chamber. When you change the amount as contained in this proposed measure, you legislate. If we give that function to the Supreme Court now and in the future, we are allowing the Supreme Court to legislate when they are not legislators, when they have not been subjected to the people's scrutiny in the form of an electoral exercise. Sa atin po binigay ng saligang batas ang kapangyarihan ito. Wala po itong pagkakaiba sa binigay sa ating kapangyarihan na tayo ang babalangkas ng budget ng national government, na hindi rin po natin pwedeng i-delegate. Wala itong pagkakaiba sa maraming batas, kagaya po ng pag-tungkol sa mga tratadong internasyonal na binigay sa Senado na hindi rin po natin pwedeng ipamigay. Kung ano po ang binigay sa atin ng saligang batas, yun po ay angking kapangyarihan ng Senado at Kongreso na walang makakabawi lang. Walang makakabawi at hindi maaalis sa Senado at Kongreso kung hindi po babaguhin ang saligang batas. At ang magbabago po ng saligang batas ay ang tao. Kung kaya nga po, sovereignty resides in the people. Nagsimula po sa preamble, we, the sovereign Filipino people, imploring the aid of the divine providence, etc., etc. So ang makapangyarihan po ay ang tao. At ang kinatawan po ng tao ay ang Kongreso. With that submission, Mr. President, I reiterate, support the postulate given by Senator Pimentel as I join him that we probably, again, will be treading on the dark alley of unconstitutionality that will lead us to trip and tumble in abdicating our constitutionally lodged legislative function. I thank you, Mr. President, for hearing this representation. I yield the floor.
Majority Leader.
I remember many years ago.
I believe
Mr. President,
colleagues,
Mr. President.
would like to be also recognized. May we recognize Senator Angara, and then of course a response from the sponsor after.
Thank you, Mr. President. If I may add to the confusion of our members, I would like to inquire of, I think Senator Pimentel is right. There's two issues here in the proposed amendment. One is the legal question. Can the power to apportion jurisdiction of courts be validly delegated to the judiciary as subject to certain standards? And the second is the policy question, which I think Senator Pimentel is more keen on. Senator Tolentino just spoke combining both rationales, law and policy. I would like to kind of fine-tune the argument further because I sense we may be coming towards a vote, Mr. President. I am wondering if in any of the jurisprudence cited by our learned colleague from Cavite, Senator Tolentino, and perhaps our chairman of justice, if they have come across any case which expressly prohibits the delegation of the apportionment of jurisdiction to the judiciary. Because my impression, Mr. President, in my limited knowledge of the law, is that the Constitution allows the legislature or gives the legislature the power to apportion jurisdiction subject to the limitations in the Constitution. And I am not so far aware, as I said, I have not pursued this line of jurisprudence, if there is an express prohibition on the delegation of the apportionment of jurisdiction. Because under the Constitution, before I yield to Senator Drilon, the minority leader, Mr. President, under the Constitution, jurisdiction seems to be a shared power because if you speak about appellate jurisdiction, for example, there was a time, I think in the 1990s or the 2000s, when the Supreme Court was deluged with appeals from the NLRC. So they, in the exercise of their power, said that appeals from the NLRC should go first to the Court of Appeals before they go to the Supreme Court. So this was an exercise, in a sense, of apportionment of jurisdiction, Mr. President, no? But of course, the wider power belongs to the legislature. That's why the Judiciary Reorganization Act of 1980 is called Batasang Pambansa Bilang 129 because it was an exercise of the judicial power. But in the exercise of its own powers, the Supreme Court has also decided questions of jurisdiction, Mr. President. Yun ang punto natin. And there are also times when the Constitution makes it express that the legislature cannot increase the appellate jurisdiction of the Supreme Court without its authority. So my impression is, like in the case of foreign policy, this question of jurisdiction seems to be a shared power between the judiciary and the legislature, with the more expansive power perhaps belonging to the legislature. So I'm just wondering, I throw it out there, I do not know the answer, Mr. President, if there is an express prohibition on delegating the power to apportion jurisdiction of courts by the Supreme Court. So provided that there are the given or the time-held principles of jurisprudence which limit the delegation. It must be pursuant to a fixed policy, and it must be to thresh out the details, etc., as ruled in many of the landmark cases regarding non-delegation of legislative power. So yun lang, Mr. President, I'd like to get the arguments in focus and separate the arguments for law, whether there is a legal prohibition on delegation and on policy. Para malinaw po sa aming mga miyembro, ano po yung decision natin, kung saan nakabase. Kung nakabase, because there are two layers of decision making, Mr. President. One will be based on the law and the Constitution. The other will be based on what we perceive to be a wise policy. And I think the chairman has made some good arguments as to why it might be wiser to provide a mechanism where we're able to adjust the jurisdiction over time. So I'm just wondering, I hope that helps, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Mr. President, before we recognize Senator Tolentino, I think I got more confused with Senator Angat. I'm just kidding. Yes, he's wearing his favorite Celtics uniform, Mr. President. That's why.
No, Mr. President. Celtics win today. Did you win today?
We had no game. We have a game tomorrow, Mr. President. I think you are still reveling in the victory of the Lakers, Mr. President.
But that does not excuse you to wear a T-shirt in session, huh?
I'm not wearing a T-shirt, Mr. This is a collared shirt, Mr. President.
All right. Senator Tolentino, yes, you have the floor.
Yes, Mr. President, just one quick reply, although earlier I yielded the floor to the esteemed gentleman from Aurora. I recall, Mr. President, 4 days ago, we had our first constitutional reforms committee hearing. I don't know if I cited the correct committee nomenclature, but I remember, Mr. President, that one of the first who spoke, Mr. President, was a former Supreme Court Justice, and the name is Justice Bibi Mendoza, Mr. President. Formerly of the Supreme Court, formerly professor of the University of the Philippines College of Law. And Justice Mendoza cited just one case in that constitutional Committee on Constitutional Reforms hearing, Mr. President, just like last week. And if I can recall vividly, the title of the case he cited is Madbury versus Madison, an old case during the 1800s, which states that Congress cannot expand the functions of the Supreme Court. By allowing Congress now to share a portion of its constitutionally large powers, we are in effect expanding the powers of the Supreme Court. Because previously, they don't have this power of adjusting the jurisdictional amount. By giving them an additional function, we are violating that original time-honored Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court case of Madbury versus Madison cited by Justice Mendoza, because we are expanding the functions, the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, which is not allowed, Mr. President. Only the Constitution can expand the functions, original or appellate, of the Supreme Court. By giving them another job in layman's term, Mr. President, it is as if we are now changing the Constitution, Mr. President. We are providing another role for the judiciary, Mr. President, when their functions are enumerated in Article 8. Yun lamang po, Mr. President, and I hope I have clarified everything as far as I know, and I thank the gentleman from Aurora for raising that issue. I have no further words, Mr. President. Yung sa akin lang po, kung ano yung nakalagay sa Supreme Court, sa Constitution, yun dapat po yung masunod. Salamat po, Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Mr. President, let us recognize our colleague, Senator Gordon, I think was raising his hand earlier. Senator Frank also would like to reply. Well, Senator Gordon, yes, Senator Gordon and Senator Drilon after.
Senator Gordon,
Mr. President, let me thank you to my good friend Senator Dillon, because Senator Dillon is the one who's sponsored the amendment, and I'm supportive of it. So I'd like to hear his arguments. I have my own arguments, and I will follow right away. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator, the Minority Leader is recognized, Senator Drilon.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. With utmost respect to the gentleman from Cavite, we believe that there is nothing in the Constitution that would prohibit the delegation of this power of Congress. And let me say for the record, because there was no prohibition on us, I consulted former Chief Justice Art Pangadiban on this. I repeat that I consulted Chief Justice Art Pangadiban, and she is no longer in the court. Certainly, there is nothing confidential. He is a columnist. And he said, no, there is nothing unconstitutional about this as long as you impose appropriate standards. And that's exactly what we are doing, Mr. President. Mr. President, we are not expanding the jurisdiction of the court. With all due respect, the argument that the grant of this authority to the Supreme Court will expand its powers is totally unsupported by the Constitution, because what the Constitution says is jurisdiction of the Supreme Court may not be diminished or reduced or by Congress. We're talking about jurisdiction over cases of the Supreme Court. Here, we are just talking about the jurisdictional amounts that the lower courts, the first and second level courts, would have jurisdiction over, not the Supreme Court. And I think to argue that granting the Supreme Court the power to determine the jurisdiction of the lower courts under a delegated power is an expansion of the power. With all due respect to Senator Tolentino, I think that argument does not hold water. Now, insofar as the delegation is concerned, please note, Mr. President, that we inserted the phrase unless otherwise provided by law. Meaning that if the Congress is not happy with the exercise of that delegation by the Supreme Court, it can always pass a law which will override that decision or that pronouncement of the court, because the jurisdiction primarily is with Congress, and we retain that by inserting the phrase unless otherwise provided by law. So that delegation is subject to that reservation. And I would repeat, anytime the Congress feels in its good judgment that the Supreme Court is wrong in the apportionment of the power in the first and second level courts, or if they do not follow the standards imposed, the Congress can revoke that ruling or that decision of the court and revise the jurisdiction. Now, all those cases cited by the good gentleman from Cavite, I have not read it, but I suspect it all refers to the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, which Congress may not diminish. That is because that is expressly provided in the Constitution when it says Congress may not deprive the Supreme Court of its jurisdiction over cases enumerated in Section 5 hereof. It has nothing to, and I would repeat, to assert that granting the authority or delegating the authority to the Supreme Court would expand its jurisdiction, I think is a little overstretched as an argument. And I would repeat, we are not revising or diminishing or altering the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, but only the first and second level courts. And as correctly pointed out by the gentleman from Aurora, in the case of the decisions of the NLRC, the Supreme Court redefined the jurisdiction by ruling, I think through administrative orders, that all decisions of the NLRC should be referred to the Court of Appeals rather than directly to the Supreme Court. So, I would support the argument that this is a question that is that has the court itself has given a very liberal interpretation. So it is our submission that as a policy issue, we should delegate this power. Mr. President, we do not have intimate knowledge of the jurisdiction and the cases in the first and second level courts. These are municipal trial courts, these are city courts, and this is the RTC. I don't think anyone can claim expertise or knowledge of the load, case load, what is happening technically in these two lower court, first and second level courts. And therefore, we rely on the judgment of the Supreme Court. Why do we have to insist that everything should go to us? Maybe this was true in years before, but today it is really impractical to continue exercising this power. We therefore submit that as a policy issue, it should be done. As a constitutional issue, it can be done. And I would repeat, we have consulted a former Chief Justice, a learned man of the law, former Chief Justice Art Panganiban, who expressed the view that the delegation to the Supreme Court of the power to fix the jurisdictional amounts in the first and second level courts are consistent with the Constitution. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator Gordon, yes, the sponsor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. To further the arguments of my distinguished confrere, Senator Drilon, who I accepted the amendment, because I don't think it's against the law, Mr. President. I think it is also wise to do so. In the first place, Mr. President, we're not amending the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. The jurisdiction of the court, if you read the law, Article 8, Section 2, the Congress shall have the power to define, prescribe, and apportion the jurisdiction of various courts, but may not deprive the Supreme Court of its jurisdiction over cases enumerated in Section 5 hereof. And what does Section 5 hereof? Every student of the College of Law, Section 8, Article 8, Section 5, the Supreme Court shall have the following powers: exercise original jurisdiction over cases affecting ambassadors, and nations for certiorari, prohibition, mandamus, quo warranto, and habeas corpus. 2, review, revise, reverse, modify, or affirm on appeal or certiorari as the law of the rules of court may provide final judgment on orders of lower courts in A, all cases in which the constitutionality or validity of any treaty, international or executive agreement, law, presidential decrees, proclamation, order, instruction, ordinance, or regulation is in question. B. All cases involving the legality of any tax, impost, assessment, or toll, or any penalty imposed in relation thereto. C. All cases in which the jurisdiction of any lower court is an issue. 5. D. All criminal cases in which the penalty imposed is reclusion perpetua or higher. E. All cases in which only an error or question of law is involved. Mr. President, there are others, but the point is we are not going through the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. We're talking about the lower court, Mr. President, which is the municipal and the regional trial court, which at the present are all overloaded, especially the regional trial court. So it is wise because it is timely. The last time we did it, as we said, is 2004. And now it's already 2021, which means that ang tagal-tagal natin kumilos. So ngayon, we are allowing, therefore, the Supreme Court some leverage, and under the phrase, unless otherwise provided for by law, which means we're not abdicating. We are just delegating, Mr. President, and we're not intruding into the essential powers under the jurisdictional provision of the Constitution, Mr. President. And therefore, I think it is all right for us so to do because it will relieve a lot of pressure. And it is also wise because the Supreme Court is nearer the grindstone than we are. The grindstone is that cannot be denied that a lot of the courts are overloaded, and in their recommendation to us, they want to reduce. Sa kanila galing, they want to reduce the jurisdiction of the level 2 courts to the municipal courts, Mr. President. So to my mind, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, we're not going to shake the whole world with it. We're just, in fact, going to benefit our people by making sure that they can now, move on with dispatch on all the cases, Mr. President, that are they have to meet, Mr. President. But also, Mr. President, it is important for us to realize there's no abdication. It is well within our power so to do. It is also the fact that there are standards. Like Senator Dillon, I also talked with my classmate, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Teresita de Castro. And the only thing that she said is it's okay. It doesn't seem to be a violation of law. It's not a violation of law, but you have to make sure that the standards of the delegation are clear. And Mr. President, and that's why I bowed to the turn of Senator Dillon to speak up, because we place standards, Mr. President. For example, reflect the extraordinary supervening inflation or the inflation of currency. 2, change in the land valuation. 3, maintain the proportion of caseload between first and second courts. Now, these are adequate standards as far as I'm concerned, Mr. President. The standards are there, and it shows that we can actually do that delegation because they are complete in all forms, and the conditions are there, which leaves no doubt as to what we're delegating. So with all due respect to our friends, and I'm glad that we have guardians of the courts here, this is outright a pleasant task because we are senators and we are lawyers at the same time. We can argue this, Mr. President, and at the same time make a decision. So I submit, Mr. President, that this will be beneficial for the court system in the country, and that we're not violating the law, we're not amending the Supreme Court again, jurisdiction. We're only trying to make the adjustments on the lower courts, Mr. President. And I think it is wise because people will always welcome the speedy disposition of cases that will obviously be the result of law when it gets passed. On those grounds, Mr. President, I also agree with Senator Angara. But again, we can agree till we're blue in the face. Eventually, we have to really make the decision, and the decision should be in favor of the benefit of our country. Mr. President, thank you very much.
Majority Leader.
Pimentel, Mr. President.
Senator Coco Pimentel is recognized.
One final sir, point, sir. So as also to buy time and to give our colleagues time to think, to go over the issue. The beauty of the law and the beautiful ability of lawyers is that we talk about the same section, but we arrive at different conclusions, Mr. President. I will also refer to Article 8, Section 2, which provides that, basahin na lang din natin, the Congress shall have the power to define, prescribe, and apportion the jurisdiction of the various courts, but may not deprive the Supreme Court of its jurisdiction over cases enumerated in Section 5 hereof. Kung makikita po natin, actually, it's a limitation on the power of Congress, the legislature. And this must be a very important legislative power that although we say na plenary ang power natin to legislate, specifically binanggit sa Constitution, apportion the jurisdiction of the courts. Pero, klaruhin namin, do not touch the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court as provided in the Constitution. So okay lang yun because it's a constitutional rule limiting another constitutional rule. Okay po yun. Tabla po yun. Same level po yun. So, yan lang po yung aking conclusion dyan that this must really be a very important legislative power to still be mentioned separately in the Constitution. So, gamitan ko na lang po siguro ng plate analogy kasi since my wife is a foodie. Okay. In the constitutional scheme of things, may tatlong plato po yan. Plato ng executive, ng kanyang powers nandun sa plato niya, mga ulam, pagkain. Plato ng legislative, plato ng judiciary. Ang gusto natin gawin, ito nakalagay sa plato natin, ilipat natin sa plato ng judiciary. As if naman, hindi pa puno ang plato ng judiciary. Puno na yun eh. Ang dami na nilang kailangan gawin. Tayo rin puno na rin, dami kailangan gawin. Pati sa executive, ganun din. Tapos yun na nga, bakit? Why? That's why I'm into the wisdom eh. What is the puno? Hindi ko masabing light ang laman ng plato nila. Puno na rin po yun. Dadagdagan pa natin. Isa atin yung binigyan ng Constitution. And then, ang nakita ko po sa arguments is that, sa exchange of ideas is that after the delegation, we will monitor how the Supreme Court is exercising the delegated legislative power. Ba't ba natin gagawin yun? Tayo na lang mag-monitor. Kasi, di ba, mag-monitor na rin po tayo eh. So, let us monitor our own power. At saka, it suddenly occurred to me, the determination of the state of facts in order to form policy is actually legislative. That is it. That is the work of the legislature. Determine the set of facts on the ground and then make or adjust policy na ipapasa natin sa Supreme Court. Purely legislative. So that is my final point, Mr. President. I hope, I mean, tama naman. I mean, there are two basic points raised in the grave reservation that we have expressed. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Yes, Senator Ping Lacson is recognized.
Thank you. Since the distinguished gentleman from Cagayan de Oro mentioned the plate analogy, meron po akong proposal. Okay, yung plato ng executive, pag-usapan na lang natin yung plato ng legislative at saka ng judiciary. If we retain the power of the legislature na kunin pabalik yung nilagyan natin sa plato ng judiciary, would that make a sound suggestion, Mr. President? We will not surrender completely the power of the legislature to give away part or portions of the viands on our plate, but we will retain the power to get it back, Mr. President. At the proper time, when before we go into voting, Mr. President, I have an amendment, with the permission, of course, of the proponent of the original amendment, Senator Drilon, I would like to propose an amendment to his amendment at the proper time, Mr. President.
But who do you want to answer your question? And that
There's no need
particular
to answer
question
because
of,
it's very
let's
basic,
say,
Mr. President. We are
kung
not,
pwedeng bawiin.
no, my proposed amendment to the amendment would in effect retain the power of the legislature to get back the food that was transferred to the plate of the judiciary. So, if I, no, without preempting, Mr. President, ito yung, although I submit, of course, that implied power ng Congress yung to legislate, to amend, or even repeal the laws that we passed. But just to assuage the concerns of our colleagues from Cagayan de Oro and Cavite, no, ito yung aking suggestion do sa amendment ni Senator Drilon. May I just insert the phrase without prejudice, however, on the part of the Congress to adjust the amounts when the circumstances so warrant. If that is acceptable to the proponent of the proponent, then I will introduce that amendment, Mr. President.
May we recognize Senator Gordon, Mr. President?
Senator Gordon is recognized.
Mr. President, I think the point of the senator is well taken. However, I respectfully posit the fact that the phrase unless otherwise provided for by law means that we can take it back. It is not an abdication, and we can add to what concerns there may be, and I think that should be sufficient. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
No, I did not mention unless so provided by law, Mr. President. The words that I use is when the circumstances so warrant.
I think the point of Senator Gordon is that in the previous phrases, they are including already in the law that in the bill that we are discussing, the phrase as may be provided by law. But what Senator Lacson is saying is that we can replace that with this particular amendment because this is very specific. Yung unless otherwise provided by law is, of course, acceptable but mas wide. And then the proposal of Senator Lacson is very specific. But I will leave it to the sponsor and the proponent of the amendment because, it's very interesting to listen to the lawyers. Especially in my case, I have been disbarred already for lawyering for Paulo Duterte and Manscarpio. So, Senator Drilon, the minority leader, is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. With all due respect to Senator Gordon, maybe we can accommodate this amendment as being all inclusive. Yes, there is a phrase unless otherwise provided by law, and we can say and without prejudice on the part, etc., etc. So there is nothing wrong with that. It can be a duplication, but there's nothing. It doesn't diminish the power of Congress to take back that delegated power. So it is my submission to the good sponsor that we can accept the Lacson amendment at the appropriate time, just to emphasize the power of the Congress to recall this delegated authority.
That is more Solomonic than the Solomonic suggestion, Mr. President.
All right. But the sponsor, Senator Gordon.
Well, I have no heartburn there, Mr. President. It only emphasizes, you see, insofar as lawyers are concerned, unless otherwise provided for by law, is often used to make sure that there's a reserved right by the legislature to pull out what has been given, Mr. President. And I'm glad that Senator Lacson is avidly listening on the debate, and if he wants to make it clear, I will agree with my friend Senator Drilon, not because he's my friend, but because I think it will allow us to really look at it more favorably. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Lacson.
All right. Majority Leader. Yes. Well, before Senator Pimentel, let's just clarify. the pending amendment or proposed amendment by the minority leader is found on what page and what line?
Mr. President, can I respond? Yes, it has not yet been formally
I
put
see.
on the table because it was just on a discussion. At the appropriate time, I will read into the record my proposed amendment, and Senator Lacson may amend it, and that is the more appropriate time. Right now, it is not yet officially submitted because we are not yet at that point. But I can read it at
All
that
right.
appropriate.
All right. So Senator Pimentel, yes, go ahead.
We will just make the manifestation at the proper time, Mr. President, that we beg the understanding of the proponents and the sponsor that if the proposed amendment to the amendment of Senator Lacson should be accommodated, actually it does not change anything because that's really, since it is legislative power, that's really implied, Mr. President. Thank you.
All right. Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. Sorry, my mind was was wandering because me and Senator Pia are still trying to finalize the create measure while they're debating about the issue in the Metropolitan Courts. Yes, Mr. President, there is a motion pending. We must act on the motion and di ba?
Yeah.
So maybe recognize
There was no mention yet. We're in the period of amendments,
Yes.
and there is no. We have not started.
No,
Senator Pimentel.
I remember the status, Mr. President. Senator Drilon stated his proposed amendment. I reacted with the grave reservation. So I think now if there is a motion to the proposed motion to amend the proposed
That's
amendment, I think
correct,
that now is the right time.
because it was accepted by Senator Gordon, Mr. President. So there's an appeal by our colleague, Senator Coco. But maybe recognize the minority floor leader, Mr. President. He's asking.
Just
to take-
thank you,
Leader
Mr.
is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just to be clear, may I be allowed, Mr. President, to read for the record the proposed amendment for the appreciation of everybody, and the Lacson amendment can be inserted. So
Alright.
with the
Before
Yes,
you do that, just for clarity, you have no amendments on page 1, 2, and 3.
it is on page 4. Yes, that's correct, sir.
Yes. So the
correct.
amendments
On my
is
part.
only on page 4.
That's correct, sir.
All right. Proceed.
On page 4, lines of 14 to 18, I think the section 3, delete the whole provision and replace it with the following. Section 3, period, delegated authority of the Supreme Court to adjust the jurisdictional amounts for first and second level courts, period. The Supreme Court, comma, unless otherwise provided by law, comma, may adjust the jurisdictional amount for first and second level courts to, number 1, reflect the extraordinary supervening inflation or deflation of currency, semicolon, parenthesis 2, parenthesis, change in land valuation, semicolon, parenthesis 3, parenthesis, maintain the proportion of the caseload between the first and second level courts. That is the proposed amendment, Mr. President, just for clarity.
All right. And what does the sponsor say?
Accept the amendment.
You are accepting the amendment. Senator
Your Honor.
Lacson.
Mr. President, my amendment to the amendment, of course, subject to style, is without prejudice, however, on the part of the Congress to adjust the amounts when the circumstances so warrant.
Will that be acceptable towards the end of your amendment, Senator Zelon?
I think somewhere in the middle, Mr. President.
Mr. President, maybe that should be inserted between the lines, between the words law and may, so that yes, we are accepting the amendment subject to style, and the provision now will read: the Supreme Court, unless otherwise provided by law, and without prejudice to the etc., to the power of Congress, subject to style.
Subject to
May I
style, and you're
address-
accepting it.
yes.
All right, what does
Yes,
the sponsor
accepted.
say?
We accept the amendment, Your Honor.
Accepted, the amendment as amended. All right, any objection? Senator Pimentel and then Senator Tolentino.
I will now use the proper terms. My grave reservation is now an objection based on the same sentiments we have already expressed. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Tolentino.
Mr. President, based on the same constitutional grounds, I interpose the same objection as rigidly framed by Senator Pimentel.
Mr. President, may I ask for a 1-minute suspension? Just for clarity amongst
All
our
right.
colleagues.
Senate suspended. 1 minute.
the period of amendment, there was a proposed amendment duly, and there was an amendment to the amendment. Proposed
Accepted.
amendment by Senator Drilon and then amended by Senator Lacson, accepted by both amendments accepted by Senator Gordon, Mr. President. So there's also an objection from our dear colleague, Senator Coco Pimentel. The next procedure is to divide the House. Mr.
Yes, an objection from Senator Pimentel and Senator Tolentino.
President, before we divide the House, Mr. President,
Yes,
Senator
Senator Gordon.
Yes, I just want to make sure for clarity that in the amendment proposed by Senator Jalon and by this distinguished Senator from Cavite, Senator Lacson, in the standards that are being set, which is number one, reflect the extraordinary supervening inflation or deflation of currency, semicolon. Two, change in the land valuation, semicolon. I'd like to add after that the word or, and then continue on. Three, maintain the proportion of caseload between first and second level courts, Mr. President.
No problem with the minority leader. So that is how the amendment is going to appear.
Yes, sir.
Subject to style. All right.
Yes.
All right. So there is an objection. We divide the House. What is the pleasure of the majority leader on how we will vote? We cannot do an ayes and nays
No,
because
sir.
of the hybrid
Yes, sir.
situation.
We'll have to have nominal voting. We'll ask the
We'll have to
Secretary
do a
to-
nominal voting. All right. In that case, the policy is that we do not hear your vote. You are not counted. All right. So you will have to state your vote, yes or no. All those who will vote in favor, all those in favor of the amendment will say yes or aye, and those who are against will say nay or no. All right. The secretary will proceed with the nominal voting.
Nominal voting. Honorable Senators Angara,
Yes.
Binay,
Yes.
Cayetano,
Wala.
De Lima, De La Rosa,
No.
Senator Cayetano voted. She said no. Yes, go ahead.
De La Rosa, no. Drilon,
Yes.
Gatchalian, Go, no vote. Gordon,
Yes.
Ontiveros,
Ay.
Lacson, Lapid, Marcos,
Yes.
Pacquiao, yes. Pangilinan,
Yes.
Pimentel III, Poe, Recto,
Yes.
Revilla Jr.,
Yes.
Tolentino, Villanueva, Villar,
Yes.
Zubiri. The Senate President, Soto III.
Yes, vote in favor. 15-5. Secretariat for the official count. But the Senate President's count is 15-5. Pacquiao made a sign of a thumbs up sign. I saw it.
Yes, I saw that, Mr. President. Senator Pacquiao gave a thumbs up sign.
All right.
Mr. President.
With 15 affirmative votes, 5 negative votes, no abstention, the Drilon amendment is carried.
Together with Senator Lacson's.
Oh, yes,
additional
obviously.
amendment.
Yes, the Senator Lacson and the Gordon amendments subject to style. Yes, it was a proposed amendment by
Thank
Senator
you, Mr.
Drilon.
President.
amended by Senator Lacson, and then further amended by Senator Gordon himself.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, we can now move to the next amendments. Hopefully, we can end the period of amendments tonight. Are there more amendments to the sponsor? And
Any more amendments?
No, Your Honor, there are no more amendments. Thank you.
very good, Mr. President. That's wonderful news. With that, Mr. President, I move that we close the period of amendments.
Any objection? Hearing none, period of amendments closed.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that we approve on second reading Senate Bill number 1886. I so move, Mr. President.
Any objection? Chair hears none. Senate Bill 1886 is approved on second reading.
Congratulations to Senator Gordon and all of our members. Thank you, Mr. President. I move to suspend consideration of the same so that we can take this up for third reading.
Consideration is suspended.
Thank you. May I ask for a 1 minute suspension, Mr. President?
Session suspended.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just a few housekeeping matters. I move, Mr. President, that we elect Senator Ramon Bong Revilla Jr. and Senator Ralph Rectos members of the Committee on Environment and Natural Resources and Climate Change, completing the 17 members of the said committee.
Hearing no objection, they are so elected.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, with the permission of the body, I move to proceed with the Senate President's designation of the Senate conferees to the Bicameral Conference Committee on the disagreeing provisions of Senate Bill number 1855 and House Bill number 5925. This is the Cooperatives Development Officer in the LGUs. I so move, Mr. President.
All right, we hereby designate as Senate conferees to the BICAM Conference Committee on the disagreeing provisions of 1855 and House Bill 5925. Senator Subiri as chairperson and members Gatchalian, Villanueva, Marcos, and Hontiveros. So designated.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I beg the indulgence of our colleagues as we're trying to finish the CREATE BICAM report. that we will tackle the other matters tomorrow, first thing, Mr. President. And of course, we'll have our create BICAM as well to be ratified tomorrow, first hour, Mr. President. That's our commitment to the people who are waiting for this measure to pass.
All right, but I hope we can include in the agenda a possible privilege speech from the presiding officer.
Yes, Mr. President, absolutely, Mr. President. We'll put that. Yes, you're the boss, Mr. President. So
I'm getting irritated by
Rules Committee is hereby ordered to do so.
yes, because I'm getting irritated by many comments of people on one of the bills on one of the laws that we have passed.
Okay, Mr. President.
Daming epal eh.
We will put that
Okay.
first thing in the agenda tomorrow.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. President. With that, I move that we adjourn session until 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Wednesday, February 3, 2021. I so move.
Any objection? There being none, the session is adjourned until 3 o'clock in the afternoon of Wednesday, February 3, 2021.